Hello, this is Robby,
And Emily.
and this is our stats final project. It's named Finding the Formula for Success.
Okay, for our introduction and background, as school counselors, we are interested in getting to know students and getting them into college and fulfilling career paths. A lot of kids fall through the cracks, and we want to catch them. And there's plenty of research out there that states that GPA and a positive school climate and visiting an effective school counselor are the strongest indicators of college enrollment. Well, with this information, we've decided that we want to find out for ourselves if this really is true. Is the relationship between GPA, school satisfaction, and comfortability in school counseling large enough to predict future success in post-secondary education? So what we're really looking for is an actual formula for success, a linear equation that could be applied to the high-achieving 4.0 student or the struggling 0.5 GPA student. It's the combination of these three variables, GPA, school satisfaction, and comfortability in school counseling. Is it strong enough to set an equation such as this into place? We shall see.
Man, she's good. She should just do all of these. But anyway, our research question was can the relationship between GPA and counselor comfortability, which we titled CC, or GPA between school satisfaction be used as an indicator for future success in education? The purpose we're doing this is we believe all students can succeed in school. GPA is an important factor about the education process, but it's not the only one. There's ongoing evidence that GPA, school satisfaction, comfortability are very reliable indicators of post-secondary success. Way more than ACT scores, which is basically 50% and 48% of student graduation. So we have a hunch that students with lower GPA can go on to succeed. They just need a little bit of support. If we're correct, we can have a far greater effect on the outcomes based on this measurement. We're decided to put our questions to a test, a statistical test. The methodology, we ran two separate regression tests. We had the independent variable, which is GPA, the counselor comfortability, CC, and school satisfaction, SS, are dependent variables. The first regression test predicts, the tests are supposed to predict. So if both tests prove statistical and practically significant, then we assume that our findings could be used as future predictors of success in high school and beyond. Basically, we've discovered a holy grail of education. So the assumptions are as following. GPA will let us predict which students want to see the counselors and how the student feels about the school. A higher GPA should be able to predict a higher school satisfaction. All students will utilize the counselors, but students with lower GPA will reach out more frequency. We have the null hypothesis and then the alternative hypothesis down there below. Okay, now we're in descriptive stats.
So for this research study, we started with a really large population set that was and we from there took a sample of that population. The population originally included some 600 students. We narrowed it down to 306 students, and we specifically looked at students within the age ranges of 15 and 16 years old. We considered male and female, and any that responded as no response. We considered all ethnicities, and then from there, we took our studies and we put it into a test. There's a couple of reasons why we narrowed it to these specific characteristics. We wanted to look at 15 and 16-year-old students because they, at this age, are really concerned about GPA. It's a key function of their education, and every year in the high school adds or subtracts from this value. 15 and 16-year-olds pay greater attention to GPA because they're preparing to take on new responsibilities. They're preparing for college. They're taking on new friendships and relationships. They have new life experiences. Some are getting new jobs for the first time. They're learning to drive. They're even maneuvering new friendships and kind of experimenting with things. The sum total of all these changes makes the student level of counselor comfortability and school satisfaction all the more significant. So this is another reason why we've chose this specific range of students. You'll notice in our population sample that the majority of our students are white. 75% of students are white. We do have a couple with in between. We have 8%, and that is our Hispanic or Latino. And then we also have, our next one is our 5% is our other ethnicity. So we've got quite a different selection there, but the majority of our students are that white Caucasian. And then the next we have a graph of all of our students, and we looked at their ethnicity, And then we looked at their degree of what they marked on their response for measures of student satisfaction in the schools, measures of comfortability with the counselor, and then also how did they score on their GPA. So that kind of gives you a good look at everything there.
Cool. Now we're in the measure of central tendency because we're interested in determining if GPA can predict students' CC and SS. So basically, the GPA scores are highly homogeneous and highly negative skewed. Our data bears little variability as most of the GPA values are concentrated to the right side of the tail. We'll show that in the next graph, but it's basically 3.5 and above. The degree of skewness of our data is negative 1.75. This further supports the findings as our value range between negative 1 and 1 are considered highly skewed. So we'll go to the next slide, which is the box and whisker plot. We do this like a general range, upper, lower, interquartile, and semi-interquartile ranges. We have the ranges listed there. And we can find that 75% of our students have a GPA of 3.0 or higher. The remaining 25% have a gap. We're not quite sure exactly why that's the case, but we have some ideas later. And we also want to ensure that the basic needs of our low-scoring students are being met via tutoring, remediation, pull-outs, group sessions, etc., which is, again, why we're looking to do predictive stuff.
And now for inferential statistics. So if I get a little bit of drum roll, and here we go. So our first regression analysis was between the GPA of our students and counselor comfortability, what the students scored on that original data set as far as how they felt about going to the counselor. And if you look at our data, you'll notice that our line has a slope to it. And that was what we were hoping for. A slope to our line tells us there's got to be some significance there. So first we'll look at our R-square. And our R-square indicates how much a student's level of counselor comfortability can be explained by that GPA. At 0.01, our R-square is really, really low, which means that at least for our sample, GPA is not a practically significant determinant of how a student feels about the school counselor. So then we look at our p-value, and our p-value tells us the degree to which our test is actually statistically significant. And because our p-value equals 0.05%, usually has to be 0.5 or less, because we're equal there, and then also because our f-stat is greater than our p-value, then we can say that our test is statistically significant. What this means is that GPA is a statistical significant indicator of a student's level or feeling comfortable with the counselor. These findings are supported by the negative slope of our line, which we talked about. So we can reject our null hypothesis. There's no slope that is 0, and leads to the moment we've all been waiting for, the linear equation of success. You see, we can plug in a number into that equation and predict what the students would score on their comfortability scale for the counselors. So this is kind of what we did for that one. In our next regression test, we looked at GPA and school satisfaction. We did the same thing, but with student satisfaction in the schools. We looked at our R-square, and the R-square indicated that the student satisfaction could be explained by, how much of the student satisfaction could be explained by GPA. At 0.00004, so a very almost nearly insignificant amount of our square, it's really too small to have any sort of significance. So we can't say that that is a practical significance for us. But then when we look at our p-value, which is 0.972, that is greater than our f-stat, which is very, very small, 0.001, and it's much greater than 0.05. So we can't say that that is statistically significant. So GPA is not a statistically significant indicator of school satisfaction. So we retain the null hypothesis. And these findings are reported by the 0 slope of our line. Sorry, guys, no linear equation for this test. So for our results, we did prove that GPA is a statistically significant indicator of a student's level of counselor comfortability, but it is not a statistically significant indicator of a student's school satisfaction. While we didn't find the magic formula for success that we were hoping for from both tests, we did discover a few things. And working with our student sample, we realized that a number of variabilities may have played a role in the outcome of our data: home life, ethnicity, gender, culture, family values. But we only considered the specific variables of our study. Humans are messy and they're not always fit right into categories. This may have played into the GPA skew that we addressed earlier in the slides. And questioning the 75% of the GPA at 3.0 and higher, there's an odd gap between those and the 25% at the bottom. So you notice that. We also found that there was a relationship of 74.5% to the counseling office, and 25.4% of our students have a negative relationship with the CC. So did we find anything else in there, Robby?
Yeah. So the reason we wanted to separate the 303 students was because we had these questions that we didn't quite understand the gaps, like Emily was saying. So basically, each third had 101 students in it. And as far as the students have a positive relationship to counseling comfortability, CC, the top third has the highest negative relationship to it, which is 44%, or 34 out of 77 students. So what that means is most students have a positive score, but out of the negative CC relationships, the top third has the most negative. And then the bottom, which is originally what we thought would have the worst, comes in as second, which is 35%. So it's just an interesting correlation there. And then as far as concerning relationships between GPA and school satisfaction, 48.5% of student populations have a negative reaction to their school satisfaction. And we're like, uh-oh, that's weird. So we looked at it in thirds, right? Every third segment had a lower satisfaction, with the top having the highest at 70%. They like their school pretty good. The middle third has 54% positive, so they kind of like it. And the bottom third has 42%. So this puts the bottom 67% of students with an average of 52% negative relationships between SS. And that is something that we wouldn't stand for as counselors. We also found that the higher GPA, the less time students visit the counseling team. So the top third only visits the counseling team more than once, 16% of the time. The middle third is there 33% of the time, and then the bottom third is 34.6%. So the bottom 2/3, they see the counselors a decent amount of time, which is pretty interesting. And we think that's pretty good. It means the counselors are doing work. So then we'll go to the next slide, which these are some of the different graphs. We're not going to talk too much about it, but it just has the predictive quality between GPA and counselor comfort, and then school connectiveness are the bottom two. Then again, additional graphs. We've taken enough of your time, so we're not going to get into too much of it, but it just, again, graphs the thirds with the GPA and counselor comfortability on the top, and then the bottom is the school connectedness. Yep. So now we're into limits of research.
And for the limits of research, we think there's some issues regarding the numbers of the scales. GPA always goes from bottom, that 1 is your lower end, and 4 is your top end. But when we looked at the school satisfaction responses and the counselor comfortability responses, we noticed that it was flipped. The school satisfaction, the top end was a 1. That meant that, yes, you really felt good about the school. And that 4 meant that, no, you didn't have great satisfaction with the school. The same was true with the counselor comfortability. 1 was the top. Yes, we totally agree that this is a good place for me to be. The 4 meant, you know what, we don't feel so much about that. And whereas that flip of the values is, we can't help but wonder if that had something to do with why our test didn't come out exactly why we hoped it would. The other thing is that we only looked at those factors. We didn't look at ethnicity. We didn't look at the Black, Indigenous people of color, which makes up about 8% of the surrounding area. And they're potentially vulnerable, and they need more psychosocial support. Our data only include 1 school sampling, but in that area, as we looked into the zip code, we found that there are 6 to 8 middle schools within a 12-mile radius. Maybe other schools have data that we're missing. We only looked at 15 and 16-year-olds, and maybe 13 and 14-year-olds have different feelings. And the survey may have captured what happened as a result of COVID. By 2022, COVID was pretty much resolved for kids to be able to be back in school. However, they'd been out of school for a while, and who knows if that had an effect on them and their decisions for when they marked on these surveys.
Yep. And so we have some suggestions for future research. So the first one is we'd probably ask them to do a little bit more data diving. Instead of just the thirds, maybe you have smaller sample sizes, maybe they're random sample sizes, quarters, 20ths, 15ths. The smaller work did help us digest and break up the data. And we found that pretty useful. So I imagine doing it in a smaller segments would also help better. We really feel like we'd want to look into school culture and why 67% of the student base has an average of 52% of negative school satisfaction. I mean, that to us is not a number that you want, right? And then we have no baseline, so we can't compare that to other schools. But again, that's not a healthy school culture. And that's one of the things that really helps students go to college and be successful, right? We've also be really interested in what the counselor team is doing well, because they have such high numbers, right? They're, the numbers are super helpful for, training purposes. They're obviously working their behinds off. And so it'd be really interesting to see the type of methodology they're doing, the conversations they're having with students, and kind of the school culture as far as the counseling team. The town environments might also be some potential answers there. The students are from upper, middle, and lower rich households. Thus, they're going to be more academically elite, and financially, there's only 2% of the 2.2 students under the poverty line, which means most families aren't. Adults are 50% college graduates and primarily white. So this is going to impact the data. And then again, we'd want to do more research on our BIPOC population, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And that might explain some of the lower ranges of SS. And